Did you know that you live next to an enchantress? Maybe you do. She's part of the charm of living in this area. Or have you grown so accustomed to her that you've already forgotten her alchemy? She's enormous. She's moody, dark and thrashing about one day, serene and delightful the next. That's actually a part of why I like her so. She can be cold, sometimes even frigid. She has the ability to take me in her arms and calm me and center me and make my bones loosen. A day with her is restorative, to say the least. It's not just what she does for me now. She's also tied to memories that have colored my childhood. Do you know her? Does she enchant you too? I'm talking about Lake Michigan. When I was young, my family vacationed every summer at Michigan's sister, Lake Superior. I come from a you should be doing something kind of family. In fact, complaining that there was nothing to do never brought about sympathy or even creative suggestions. It only brought a wheelbarrow full of chores. So I soon figured out it was best to look busy. Each summer, we would drive to a tiny little town called Hawthorne, Wisconsin, where my grandmother lived. My dad and his brothers would work on any big projects that Grandma had and needed done on her house. We kids would make ourselves scarce, reading old Nancy Drew books from her bookshelves, picking blueberries, and wandering off to the county cemetery where our grandpa lay, making up stories and playing among the tombstones. Once the men were done working for the day, we would pile into the car and we would drive to Lake Superior. There's something about water that I can't see the other side of. That's just amazing to me. You can have those cute little up north lakes that you can see all the way around. Give me an expansive horizon and the wonderment of not really knowing what's out there. As a child, I imagined whales and submarines, pirate ships and sunken treasures. In its presence, I always feel connected to something bigger than myself. That water is so large and ever-changing, flowing from rivers and lakes and maybe even oceans from across the world. So once my family was at the lake, we would stake out our towels in the sand. My mom would unpack a picnic, and we kids were free to do whatever. My older brother directed us in making rafts out of driftwood logs, or I might get lost in making sand castles and decorating them with rocks and twigs. My dad would take to the lake with a bar of Fell's Naphtha soap, and he would scrub off the workday sweat. My mother was an avid swimmer. She would tuck her hair into a rubber swimming cap, and she would ritually swim out to the same spot every visit. My parents relaxed there. They read books, they napped or chatted quietly as we kids ran freely. The freedom to do nothing was allowed there. The lake enchanted my parents too. They let time evaporate, and they didn't hear the call of responsibility that nagged them at home. These feelings grew deep in my bones during those childhood summers, and now, whenever I'm in front of a large body of water, the enchantress still whispers in my ear, reminding me that we are connected and that surprising things are still possible, just like when I was a child. As children, we fall more easily into the mysteries of enchantment. We don't necessarily know how everything works, so we eagerly fill in the blanks with our own imaginings. But even without that kind of magical thinking, when we were young, we certainly were more aware of how things made us feel when we were fully engaged in them. Remember playing neighborhood games in the evenings in the summer? We would play capture the flag for hours, fully working side by side in complete connection to our teammates, and we knew how to navigate all the tricky areas of the neighborhood to win over the flag. And in the twilight of a warm summer night, time felt so different. Recently, I came across a book by Katherine May called Enchantment, Awakening Wonder in an Anxious Age. She agrees that enchantment seems to come easily to us as children, but it's something we tend to put away as we become adults. When we're young, our childlike curiosity could sometimes lead to disappointment or hurt. As a result, as we matured, we learned to turn to self-protection first, choosing certainty over curiosity, armor over vulnerability, and knowing over learning. As May pondered enchantment and the loss of it in her life, she realized she wanted to cultivate it again. After COVID and the political upheaval that we've experienced in the last few years, she felt it was necessary for her own mental health and for her spirit to do so. Because the only word that made any sense to her about how she was feeling was discombobulated. I confess I feel discombobulated these days too. Connection is what I'm searching for, May stated. The chance to merge into the drift of the world, to feel fully engaged and to enter into its wealth so completely that I forget myself. Dr. Sharon Blackie, an award-winning writer and psychologist, says that enchantment has nothing to do with fantasy, escapism, or magical thinking like one might expect. Instead, it's founded on a vivid sense of belongingness to a rich and many-layered world. She says it's a profound and wholehearted participation in the adventure of life. As someone who's now retired and just had her husband join her in retirement, these are words that name some of the feelings I want to have about this next stage of my life, something I'd like to find again. I've always loved the word adventure. I'd like to enter into this last quarter of my life with a sense of adventure as well. I was struck by the words Dr. Blackie used in her definition. They were similar words that I've heard from one of my favorite teachers, Dr. Brene Brown, who's a researcher of vulnerability and shame. It made me want to delve into both of their words more deeply. In seminary, we would often say, let's unpack that. And I'd like to do that this morning with this phrase about enchantment by Dr. Blackie. It's a lot to take in, so let me repeat it. Enchantment is founded on a vivid sense of belongingness to a rich and many-layered world, a profound and wholehearted participation in the adventure of life. When I unpack statements, I always like to start with a definition. The dictionary gives this explanation of the noun enchantment: a feeling of great pleasure or delight. As I read this definition, I thought about the sense of enchantment I feel when I'm at Lake Michigan. It certainly gives me pleasure and delight as I feel, smell, and touch all that's around me. The energy of the lake seeps into my bones, and it physically and mentally relaxes me. So this description of pleasure and delight certainly rings true. Holding that, let's keep unpacking. She says, enchantment is founded on a vivid sense of belongingness. A vivid sense of belongingness. The word belonging stood out to me too, because Brene Brown talks a lot about the differences of fitting in and belonging. She says fitting in is about assessing the situation and then changing ourselves to become what we need to be accepted. Her definition of belonging is that we're not required to change at all. To belong, we only need to be who we already are. Where were these words when I was trying to find my place in a new school as a child, or as a new employee, or even a new member of a family? How often have you tried so very hard to figure out how to fit in, how to change yourself with a new person or a group, only to figure out later that you never really felt comfortable or often felt left out or misunderstood. And then I think again about people or groups that I've fallen in with who immediately accept me just as I am. That feeling is completely different than trying to change yourself. If you feel belonging, you feel comfortable, you feel seen. That's an entirely different connection than trying to fit in. When belonging occurs, we feel enchantment. We've all experienced that with the people, and it's magical, isn't it? Dr. Blackie goes on to say that we feel this belonging in a rich and many-layered world. For me, I see this as connection, the sense of being a part of something bigger than ourselves. And I truly feel that at Lake Michigan, the ocean, or any other great body of water. It's almost impossible for me not to feel that. It's not just the water. It's that all of my senses are engaged. The texture of the sand, and I love sand, my husband hates it. The sound of birds calling to each other, the loud or sometimes quiet waves that run up to the shore, that surprising shock of the coolness of the water. The vast expanse of that horizon always mesmerizes me. It's a multi-sensory and an emotional experience for me, and it definitely feels multi-layered. Dr. Blackie goes on to say that enchantment is a profound and wholehearted participation in the adventure of life. The word wholeheartedness stood out to me too, as a word and a way of living that Dr. Brene Brown has researched. She defines wholeheartedness as a way of engaging our lives from an inner sense of worthiness and then bringing our full selves to the table. That means truly believing that we're worthy of being present, of being seen just as we are, truly believing that we belong, and then bringing our gifts and talents with us wherever we go. Bring it to the table, meaning all the things we engage in and all that we show up for. And here's the thing. When we so bravely do that, and we all have times in our lives when we do it, I bet those musicians feel that every single time they play. Life can't help but become an adventure. And that's enchantment. It sounds lovely. It really does. But then why do we so rarely engage in it? What do we risk? What keeps us from that? Katherine May says, it feels like we're often on high alert these days. We've spent so long anxiously scanning our news feeds that we now live in a fixed state of relentless checking. This has become our reading material now. We're not really looking for anything, we're just looking. Do you find yourself doing that? I know I do. Dr. Anna Lemke, a psychiatrist that specializes in opioids and their effect on our brain, has now done studies on how our mind reacts to increased levels of dopamine. Dopamine is a part of our neural pathway that's critical for keeping us alive. These mechanisms evolved in our brain to draw us to things we need, like water and food, and safety and social interactions. For decades, scientists thought dopamine drew us to these things by providing a strong sense of pleasure. You often hear that, dopamine equals pleasure. But over the past decade, new research indicates dopamine does not make you feel happy. Dr. Lemke's studies now show that dopamine actually generates desire, not pleasure. Dopamine makes you want things. And it goes even further. Dopamine tells your brain to pay particular attention to whatever triggers that surge of wanting. And here's the surprising part. You might not even like the activity that triggers the dopamine surge. If you talk to people who spend a lot of time shopping online or going through social media or news feeds, they don't necessarily feel good after doing so. Lemke says, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that it's quite the opposite, that you end up feeling worse than before. And this goes hand in hand with reports that today's youth are more anxious and depressed due to too much time on social media. And yet, there we are, often scrolling through our news feeds or social media, wanting, seeking something. Katherine May says that in the last few years, it felt like if we stopped looking, something terrible might happen. And to be honest, there were times when terrible things really did happen in the last few years. She says, looking has become our magical thinking. At first, it used to feel proactive, but now it's starting to feel a bit possessive. Now, she says, if we don't check, if we aren't constantly looking, we worry about not knowing what's going on. And I know that feeling. Someone will say, oh, did you see that article about blah, blah, blah? And you're like, oh, no, what's happening? May says that the last thing propping up the sky is our eternal vigilance to the latest events. As I reflected on this and how often I can fall down the rabbit hole of the internet, I am determined not to allow the last quarter of my life to be defined by this. My husband laughs at me because I have refused to read any more articles about a certain ex-politician. He tells people that in my world this man does not exist. And it's true. I don't want to give that person any more of my time or energy. There are more important things to tend to, and to be completely honest, outside of voting, I can't control his antics. So I stopped giving him my vigilance. Getting caught up in the web of his nonsensical world was adding weight and anguish to my life. He made me feel discombobulated. And to be honest, at my age, when I'm never really even sure what day it is, that's the last thing I need. Instead, I want to engage in things that enchant me. Things that make me feel connected to something bigger than myself and help me to live wholeheartedly. So what can we do to find these things? I chose to start with things I know I love doing. Things that when I'm engaged with them, time seems to evaporate. I'm a writer. When I sit down to write, suddenly 3 hours have passed in what seems like 20 minutes. It surprises me every single time. Writing is a place where I bring my whole self to the table. The words I share with you whenever I visit are a large part of those efforts. You are all so kindly holding my words with respect, reflection, and grace. I feel my connection with you in these words and in you hearing them. It's magical. It's enchanting. A friend of mine is a type A accountant who's run her own business for decades. She rarely sits still. She's very good at what she does, and people appreciate her work. But the real enchantment in her life is bird photography. There, she sits quietly. She sits still in a field waiting for just the moment when the birds come and visit her. There, she is so quiet. 3 hours passed and she's amazed. Her body rests in that time. Her mind quiets and time stands still. It's enchantment. So what enchants you? Poetry, creating art or music, animals, nature, gardening, loved ones. We all have things or people we know that draw us in, accept us fully, and allow us to be our wholehearted self. I invite you to go home today and think on this. When does time evaporate for you? When do you feel a connection to something bigger than yourself? Seek these things more often. Hold these things close to your bones. They're magical and they're necessary for our mental health and our physical health. Do not let social media or news feeds fool you into thinking that vigilance there constitutes better living. Choose adventure over self-protection. Try something you've always been interested in. Risk discovery. Risk failing. I tried to start playing the ukulele. I suck. I'm so bad. Do not choose certainty over curiosity. Keep wondering and in re-examining your beliefs and thoughts. Lay down your protective armor and instead share your vulnerability. As I often say, you'll be surprised how doing so always creates connections to other. Armor only keeps people out. And as Unitarian Universalists, we should all continue to embrace learning over knowing, holding our current truth ever so lightly in our hands. I suspect a big part of our country's divisions right now is that each side is clutching their knowing too tightly in their hands, afraid to let go of what might not be true. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be big things that enchant you. I find small things can be magical too. After randomly reading 3 books that had strong beekeeping characters in them, I became enchanted by the description of the habits and intelligence of bees. I wanted to learn more about them, and amazingly enough, I found out that a woman in my book group kept bees. I asked her if I could help her. She was delighted to have me join her. I was a little nervous, but I entered into it with wholeheartedness and, well, an entire beekeeping suit. But I was immediately enchanted by this tiny community, so busy and so bustling. While we pulled out the screens of the hive and cleared away excess wax, bees created an extra level of skin on my already gloved hand, and I could feel their warm and buzzing energy. Their musky, sweet smell and low vibrations centered me. Time disappeared. I marveled at them performing their different duties, and I got lost in their intensity of purpose. I was enchanted. Katherine May shared how she used to love to look at the moon. When she was a child, she even had conversations with the moon. But of course, as she aged, she packed away that habit. And in her desire to seek enchantment again, she woke one night and decided to go out and visit her old friend. Walking out into her yard in the silver light of the moon, she sat down in a chair and kicked off her slippers and let her feet make contact with the cool grass of the earth. She instantly felt that reciprocity between the earth and herself. She said she closed her eyes and relieved herself even of a search for language, but instead just let herself feel. As the moon watched her so patiently, she felt its tenacious pull, and she wondered how she could have ever forgotten this habit, and she vowed to return to it again and again. She was enchanted. We're forgetful creatures, obsessed with the endless tasks that weigh heavily on our days. They cloud our eyes from seeing the celestial and earthly dance that wants to share its enchantment with us. In our reading earlier, Mary Oliver tells us that our work is mostly to stand still and to be enchanted. That magic, that alchemy is available all the time, and yet the truth seems so easily hidden from our view. Everything is connected. There's only one whole, and we exist within that system. Katherine May says she doesn't have to believe in God as a deity, but instead she sees God as the entire mesh of existence that binds us all together and to everything in ways that we can see and feel if we only open ourselves up to it. Enchantment has always been there. It never left us. We left it. As I enter into this last chapter of my life, I intend to engage with profound wholeheartedness into this enchanting adventure of life. And I wish the same for you. May it be so.